Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. This episode of the show is brought to you by Wondrium, which is a new configuration for the Great Courses, expanding their online and streaming content from courses taught by professors, like yours truly. I have two of them myself, and hundreds of other courses and documentaries and films and both video and audio content of all kinds. It's really cool. It's a great system. You can access the site and all their content online at your laptop, on your digital platform, or on your phone. Like in my case, you just touch the W app there. It pops right open to, well, this one I happen to see just a course I think I want to take. You can scroll through and just see all the different courses that are available here. But this one in particular, I don't know if you recognize this character there. That's Princeps. He's the assassin that shot the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 in Sarajevo that triggered the First World War. That indeed is one of the crimes of the century. Anyway, this is a course that you can take. I'm going to take. Lectures are about 30 minutes each. Listen to them at 1.2 or 1.3 speed. You can plow through them about 20 minutes. So on a daily commute or workout, you can get 2 or 3 lectures in and get through a course. In this case, 12 courses, just a matter of days, and lots of great content. So here's the deal. By accessing it through my podcast, you get a free month of content consumption. So check it out. It's wondrium.com/Shermer to get your free month of content consumption at Wondrium. So it's Wondrium, WONDRIUM.com/Shermer. Wondrium.com/Shermer. A full month of free content, and then you can cancel after that, or just subscribe. It's great. I do, and you should too. It's just a great source of being an autodidact and teaching yourself. All right. Thanks for listening to this episode. My guests today are Lesley Newson and Peter Richardson. Their new book is A Story of Us, a new look at human evolution. Lesley Newson is Research Associate at the University of California, Davis. Her first career was as a science communicator. She was a writer and producer of radio and television science programs for the BBC, and has also written a number of books including Devastation, the World's Worst Natural Disasters, and All About People. In her mid-40s, her growing interest in human evolution caused her to try a career change. In 2002, she received a PhD for investigation of potential evolutionary explanations for the recent rapid change in people's beliefs about childbearing. This work led to her meeting, collaborating with, and eventually marrying her co-author. She continues to study the evolution of modern culture today. Pete Richardson is Distinguished Professor Emeritus in the Department of Evolutionary Science and Policy at the University of California, Davis. During his first career, he studied the ecology of lakes, but he also became increasingly interested in human evolution. Beginning in the 1970s, he and colleague Rob Boyd were among the scholars who laid the foundation of cultural evolutionary theory. This work has been hugely influential in the development of dual inheritance theory, which looks at how genes and culture co-evolve. His books with Rob Boyd include Culture and the Evolutionary Process in 1985 and Not by Genes Alone in 2005. His current research is focused on cultural evolution, the origins of tribal and large-scale cooperation, and the origins of agriculture, most of which are topics we cover in this conversation, including the origins of language, the origins of agriculture, the origins of morality, the origins of war and conflict, marriage, monogamy, polygamy, and so forth. And really the big picture, the origins of these culture gens or memes or gene culture coevolution units, whatever you want to call them. And anyway, so it was a great and deep conversation. Pretty long for the podcast, but that's okay. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. And by the way, please do offer support at skeptic.com/donate. The podcast is supported by the Skeptic Society. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. So all your support in that endeavor goes to the magazine, all our media work, the podcast, and so forth. Thanks.
The basic argument of the book is that human evolution is a coevolution between genes and culture. So the whole human adaptation is built around exploiting our ability to make tools and build social organizations based upon culturally transmitted information. And most evolutionary takes on humans emphasize the genetic part of evolution. In fact, many evolutionists don't think that culture evolves at all, in at least in the same sense that genes do. And we argue that culture heavily influenced our physique and the size of our brain, and all of these kinds of things are built in the service of being able to adapt culturally to variable environments.
And also, we have all these capacities, which allow us to be cultural. I mean, the way we can connect, the way we can communicate. It's hard to explain why we're like this if we weren't evolved to have an evolving culture and to have close connections with people. And can I say that another thing that is different about our view of evolution is that it talks a lot about what women and children are doing. Because it seems that for most of the popular books on human evolution, there's been this sort of generic human person, which is, of course, a guy, right? Who's doing guy things. And everybody who understands anything about evolution knows that the important thing is having offspring. And to the extent that women are really involved in the old bringing up offspring thing, the women and the offspring themselves are just really, really important for our evolution. So that's the difference in view. This isn't to say that it's different from what a lot of scientists say. It's just different from what a lot of the public thinks of when they think of evolution. That they still think of evolution as being the guy with the club dragging the woman by the hair, right?
Yes. I think that's not a unfair characterization. At least the way it's historically it's been presented. I do think it's much better now because there are way more women now working in the field. I mean, if you look at evolutionary psychology, I don't know, it's like something like 70% women that are getting degrees in that field, and same thing in medicine and so on. I guess analogously, it would be the model for medicine for centuries was just the male body and the male physiology, and obviously you're leaving out half the population there who may not have the same, percent body fat and same physiology and hormone levels and so forth. So I think that's fair. I had a discussion with this with Naomi Oreskes, the philosopher and historian of science, in her book "Why Trust Science," and that it's not just that men have been misogynistic historically. It's that even the questions that are asked or the models that are used or metaphors or analogies are more male oriented if you only have men working in the field. So introducing and bringing women into a field, it isn't that it feminizes the men necessarily or makes them less misogynistic, although maybe that does, but just the kinds of questions that are asked or the different kinds of approaches to answering questions. And that's the value of that kind of diversity.
But I think the other thing that we who study culture know is that no matter what, culture is an inherited system. And inherited systems always have lags. So no matter how busily the scientists are scurrying along, making new discoveries and having new insights, it's just going to take a long time for it to drag the rest of the population behind it. So if people are behind, it's hardly surprising. All we wanted to do in writing this book was to, break a few holes in the walls so that people could see what the scientists are up to nowadays, which is really exciting.
Yeah, so you talk about gene culture coevolution in the book. And that was the original way, I think, that Ed Wilson described it in the 70s with his sociobiology book. But then he coined the term culture gen. That it's a unit that could be selected for or something like that. But that kind of lost out in the battle of ideas or memes or whatever by memes. Richard Dawkins introduced memes at the end of The Selfish Gene, and that seemed to catch on more than culture gens. But what do you mean? I don't want to put words in your mouth of what you're trying to argue here compared to what those ideas are. What do you mean by gene culture coevolution?
Well, Ed Wilson had the idea that what did he call it? Epigenetic rules. So his view of coevolution was that culture was guided by these epigenetic rules, and that was what he and Lumsden called the complete coevolutionary circuit, if you remember from their book. And our argument is that it's a two-way street. Wilson called it the leash, right? And he imagined that there was a big guy leading a small dog. At least that's my picture of it. And I don't know if you know the cartoon Marmaduke, where Marmaduke is this Great Dane, and it's very unclear who's leading who when Marmaduke is on the end of a leash. And so our view is that culture shapes the genome by exerting selective pressure on genes. So take chimpanzees whose societies are structured by a dominance hierarchy, and humans have a certain tendency to try to dominate each other as well. But it seems to me that the closest human analogy to a chimpanzee is a psychopath, and in humans, about 2 or 3% of human males will pass the criteria for psychopathy. I think everybody thinks it's just it's a dimension, and all of us are a little psychopathic, but some of us meet the clinical criteria for being diagnosed as a psychopath. And so, essentially, people talk about humans having domesticated themselves, and it seems to me that that's a good analogy. That humans are much more docile and tame, if you want, than chimpanzees, and that has to be because it seems to me because we have societies that operate on the basis of rules, and people who obey the rules get rewards, and people who disobey the rules get punished, and that over the course of human evolution has made us this relatively docile creature that can organize large-scale cooperative societies, and on a scale, even amongst hunter-gatherers, on a scale that exceeds anything that our close relatives can do. So that, it seems to me, is an example of gene culture coevolution. Our relative docility is a product of cultural rules selecting for genes that make cooperative societies possible.
Yeah, I had Richard Wrangham on the podcast with his book about self-domestication, and it's such a fantastic idea of how that could actually happen, physically happen. So we should distinguish here between,
Can I just point out?
Please.
I met Richard. I met Richard at a conference. My first time I met Richard, and he talked about self-domestication, and we get the same thing in our book. I mean, he's done a lot more work on it, but he has it all being done by guys, right? Well, there are these bad guys, and then these other guys, and then these guys beat up on the bad guys. And I said, well, what if it was done by mothers? What if you, as a mother, you had 3 or 4 kids, and one of them is just a little bastard. You can't control him. He's always beating up on his brothers and sisters, so you stop feeding him. You know, you send him on a long walk. Because if you want to bring up as many kids as possible, you don't want the one that's beating up on his little brothers and sisters, right? So it's and the mothers don't have anything to lose. I mean, the mother isn't worried about her 8-year-old monster hurting her, so she can afford to punish him. So it seems that this domestication was done by mums, rather than by the guys. I mean, obviously, guys were probably involved too, but it probably happened early in life.
Is there evidence for that in modern hunter-gatherer groups where the females discipline the unruly children?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Hunter-gatherers are reluctant to punish anybody. They allow people a lot of autonomy. On the other hand, you've seen these pictures, perhaps, of in hunter-gatherers or horticulturalists letting kids play with steel tools. So there's a sequence. I can't remember who filmed it, but there's a sequence of a little boy, I think, about 3 years old. He's got a big machete and he's playing with a machete. His mother just lets him play, and so it could be that neglect of children that are too or ill behaved might be an important force.
Well, for what it's worth, I have a 5-year-old. So we've been going to playground since he was, like 2. And you can see the little shit starter boys that are just out of control very early on. And the mothers are really on top of it. They don't want to be responsible for their kid, heaving your kid off the slide, top of the slide or whatever. So that may be right, Lesley. But these examples that Richard Rangan comes up with, for example, he and I both worked on, let's see, what's his name's book, the anthropologist from USC who wrote about the origins of morality. Anyway, he has a database of Christopher Bohm, of bullies. So here's the problem to be solved. That the vast majority of people with the dark triad, psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, are males. I mean, Steve Pinker is fond of saying the number one predictor of violence is maleness. I mean, we've had, I don't know how many dozens of mass public shootings this year already. You can predict with 99% certainty more than that. A better prediction than can ever be made about anything else in social science. It's going to be a guy who engaged in the mass public shooting, almost 100%. Okay, so this is why whoever is actually doing the domestication, yes, perhaps women had a part of that, but the problem to be solved is men violence with the dark triad. Because Kevin Dutton, the psychologist, is fond of pointing out that psychopathy by itself is not a predictor of violence because a lot of the traits of psychopathy you want in a Wall Street trader, a killer lawyer that's going to defend you, a Navy SEAL guy that's going to go over and be a badass motherfucker with the bad guys and keep them in check, and so on. And so that's good, right? And a lot of them are CEOs of major corporations. They're not going to kill anybody. But you don't want to be their best friend, maybe, or married to them, or I don't know what. But anyway, so just to get back to where you were talking about before, to what extent this is heritable. So the problem to be solved is not just why we're violent, but why we're cooperative, why we're pro-social, how we solve collective action problems that chimps or bonobos, even, who are much nicer than chimps, they're super domestic. They just have sex after they have a fight. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? That sounds good. But yet they're not solving collective action problems. They're not, setting up courts and building interstate highways or whatever. So how do you address the problem? Like, why do we have such big brains? Why are we bipedal with free hands and making tools and having extended families and communities and societies and then governance systems of rules and norms that no other primate has?
So I think I think it's linked to the big brain because it makes our children impossible to raise unless mothers get lots and lots of help. Mothers need help from other mothers. There needs to be a cooperation and a coordination to economies of scale, right? If you have a couple of mothers and they join their kids together in a daycare center, some of them can go off and forage while the others look after them all. The kids can be kept safe. You don't have to drag them around with you. And then once the kids get to a certain age, they've got to be part of the team, right? Who's better to look after a 4-year-old than an 8-year-old? Because, they learn responsibility because they're responsible for that 4-year-old. And if the 4-year-old hurts themselves, then they're in trouble. So they become part of a team. And if they don't become part of a team, they don't have reproductive success. And the males need to be involved too. Unlike with almost every other mammal, the males don't do a stroke of work to help bring up the kids. A lot of men work really hard to help bring resources, protect, and even do some hands-on childcare. And so it had to. I mean, the most fundamental problem in evolution is raising the young. Raising these enormously brained kids just takes a long time. It can't be done by mothers on their own. That's my argument. What do you think of it, Michael?
Yeah. But then to take it one step back, why do we have such big brains in the first place? I was glad in chapter 1 you discuss Alfred Russel Wallace. I wrote a biography of Wallace called In Darwin's Shadow. That was my doctoral dissertation. And how he differed from Darwin, particularly on cognition, on the evolution of cognition. And what bothered him was that if natural selection operates the way we think it does, what do you need a brain that big? I mean, it consumes massive amounts of energy. The brain the size of a chimp is plenty of cortex. There's plenty of brain. And most animals have tiny little brains. They do just fine. And then on top of that, not just the size of the brain, but he was baffled by how natural selection could explain aesthetic appreciation, mathematical ability, musical ability, artistic ability and appreciation. And, of course, he turned to a more spiritual or supernatural element. But he also talked about culture as explaining this. So I'd be curious to know what your answer is to this long conundrum of why we have such big brains.
So we argue in that science paper that you mentioned, that science review, it seems to me that apes are sort of pre-adapted, to the old term, by having bigger brains than most mammals to start with. The whole lineage does, and we also have hands, and particularly when Australopithecines became bipedal, then our hands could be specialized for tool making, and so that's one important component. The other thing that Rob and I claimed in our 85 book is that what culture is good for is adapting to spatial and temporal heterogeneity, variable environments. So in the Pleistocene, environments got extremely variable by comparison to most of the Earth's history, we think. So it wasn't until the early 90s that we really understood how wildly variable the last ice age was from cores raised in Greenland. And there was all of this millennial and submillennial scale variation. And that's just the kind of thing that culture would be adapted to. And apparently we need big brains to manage culture. It's just exactly what the big brain does is still to me a little bit mysterious. But is it just the analog of mass storage? Is it just the analog of a hard drive, or is it computational power? Is it the chip the logic chip that is what our big brains are all about, or both? I don't I'm not a psychologist. I don't think I know what the answer is, but it does seem like Kevin Leyland. I don't know if you know his work at all, but he and one of his colleagues looked at brain size and innovating ability and cultural social learning abilities in primates, and that correlates pretty well with brain size, particularly the cortical size, not the whole brain, but the neocortex part of the brain. So my answer is that it's a combination of these 8 pre-adaptations and then this wild climate. And it's also true that all throughout the Cenozoic, many mammalian lineages.
Whoa. Oh, that's bizarre. Hang on. Transistor radio.
Wow.
I have a. This is a wild story for you. Sorry for the interruption. This radio, I wrote about this radio in one of my Scientific American columns. This radio was given to my wife by her grandfather. Well, she inherited it when he died, but they spent a lot of. She was raised by a single mom and her mom's dad, so her grandfather. And so when she left Germany to come to America to be with me, which I still find astounding, she shipped this radio. It was dead, and it hadn't worked in decades. And so I put new batteries in it, and tried all the techniques to get it to work, like slapping it on a firm surface and that sort of thing. And it was dead. And the day we got married, it just spontaneously turned on, just like right now, except right now it was static. But the day we got married, it came on. It was playing this really romantic music. Anyway, so my hardcore skeptic fans thought I'd lost my mind when I wrote about this strange, anomalous coincidence connected with love and marriage. And of course, my friend Deepak Chopra said, "That's how it works, Shermer. It's love that brings the energies and the synchronicity together." I'm like, well, okay, I don't know about that, but anyway, it's so funny that here we are talking about social relationships and the importance of a family and love between people and children, and the radio comes on. Okay, how about that for a little diversion? That's pretty crazy. Sorry about that interruption. We can leave this in because it's just a podcast. What the hell? So back to your point. So I was thinking of Robin Dunbar's research on the ratio of cortex to the rest of the brain, and then the correlation with the size of social groups. So if I recall his theory correctly, and I don't know how well that's stood the test of time, but that the bigger the ratio of cortex or neocortex to the rest of the brain, you can remember more relationship details, and then you can have a larger social network. And that's the famous Dunbar number of 150 plus or minus a dozen or two. That works pretty well. And yet, but chimps and gorillas and bonobos and gibbons and so forth have nothing like that. And so I don't know. So it sounds similar to what you're talking about.
So, well, in the book, we invented this idea of a social tool. I actually, the phrase is something that archaeologists talk about all the time. They talk about a statue or a symbolic thing as being a social tool. And I thought, that's so good. Is an idea of what humans invent. Because, it's really hard to keep all your friends in line. So you have this social tool called an address book. And you have a social tool called, your contacts on your phone. I mean, we have so many social tools. Because we have tools, which is what humans do. We invent tools, right? These are social tools that make the kind of the Dunbar number really malleable. Because we don't have to remember all this stuff about 150 people because our phones remember it, or we've got it written in the olden days, got it written down in our address book and all this kind of thing. Or we use rules of thumb like, oh, that guy's got scars on his cheeks. That means he's part of my tribe because the scars are just the same. So I'm going to trust him and he's going to trust me because, we're okay together. So I think that culture just roots around and gets around all kinds of things in our brain to allow us to deal deal with things better. The physical tools we have help us work the earth better and our environment better. The social tools we have help us work each other better.
Yeah, and just to critique the Dunbar number a little bit, so in hunter-gatherers, there tend to be bands of people that live together in a given camp, and that number of people is generally smaller than 150, something about half or a third of that size. And on the other hand, bands are linked together into tribes or ethno-linguistic groups that typically run around, for hunter-gatherers, run around 1,000 or 2,000 people. So the Dunbar number sort of doesn't, to my way of thinking, doesn't actually correspond to any natural unit in hunter-gatherers, imagining that the living hunter-gatherers are something like our ancestors. So there's and the size of bands is limited by logistics, basically. And Kim Hild, have you ever you follow Kim work? So Kim and colleagues have written a couple of papers in which they point out that bands are fairly ephemeral. So people move from one band to another quite a lot. And so across a lifetime, people tend to run into camp with several hundred people. Not just the band itself is an open, fluid group, and so people deal with each other as fellow tribesmen, if you want. For example, the Great Basin Shoshone lived in Nevada and surrounding high desert areas, and they moved quite as small family bands because of the sparse resources. And then in the wintertime, they pitched up in various places and camped together. And you could camp with anybody that spoke Shoshone. That was you recognized a fellow tribesperson. You may never have met them before, but if they spoke Shoshone, they were good candidates to camp with and for the winter. And so some people call it anonymous society. So you don't have to know the name of the person or their reputation. If they're a fellow band member, fellow tribesperson, you know that they have roughly the same conventions and institutions as you do, and so they're relatively easy to live with. Even if you don't know them, you can establish a relationship fairly quickly and easily. And that, it seems to me, is one of the hallmarks of human societies, is this ability to form groups of people that who are marked by markers of dialect, dress, and so on. And that's the kind of thing that social insects, at least the more advanced social insects, have the same thing. There's honeybees, there's a colony odor that a fellow bee is from your colony just by sniffing them. Well, insects don't sniff exactly, but they have olfactory sensors, and so that's sort of a characteristic of very large-scale societies is this ability to deal with people who are strangers, or at least not known to you personally.
Yeah, so these are social tools to build trust between strangers who you should otherwise be leery of, because the world's a dangerous place, and people from other groups could be risky to just stick your hand out and shake their hand. That's that kind of test.
Yeah, exactly. Now we're pretty good. Rob Boyd and I have just written a paper that's posted on one of these archive sites, and the people are also pretty good at making peace with other groups. So we surveyed hunter-gatherers for the idea of the paper is that hunter-gatherers, even hunter-gatherers, can when they can solve a logistic problem, they can assemble in pretty large units to do things like drive game over cliffs and things like that, build fish weirs but also trade and make peace with other groups. So trade is valuable usually because people are living in a heterogeneous environment, and one group's got good tool stone available, another group has a surplus of meat or some other food product, and so trade is quite valuable. And so people, even if they fight, sometimes they try to make peace when the fight's over, and so that they can establish trade relationships, and this can operate on a quite large scale. So in Aboriginal Western United States, things like shell from the Gulf of California or from the California coast got traded far inland, and some valuable stuff from the Pueblo people in the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico got traded clear across into the Great Basin, for example. Not much, but some.
So what we need to do now is...
You ever been to that buffalo head smashed in, I think it's called, in Canada, where the Native Americans would chase the buffalo down that valley? It was like maybe a 4 or 5% downhill grade. So gradual enough that, but they pick up speed, and then all of a sudden it just drops off, and hundreds of buffalo would just land on their heads at the bottom of this ravine. Incredible. Yeah. But that must have taken some coordination to do. I mean, you go to the right, you go to the left, and then in 10 minutes we're going to all jump out and spook the buffalo. To, that takes some cognition, some abstract reasoning, and also communication with others.
Yeah, planning. In the science paper, we have a classic painting of Plains Indians riding horses and driving buffalo off a cliff. That's a good example of human cooperation. The other photo that we used was an Amish barn raising with about 40 guys clambering over a skeleton of a barn that they're building all in a day. So yeah, humans are very good at cooperating in large groups. And again, hunter-gatherers are strictly limited by logistics. They can't feed themselves for very long in large groups, so they have to split up. But for special occasions, they can gather the whole tribe together sometimes.
So this gives us hope that we can get over the partisanship that we have right now. I mean, it just seems crazy.
I know. I love the end of your book. It was inspirational, but the moment we're going through, it just seems so depressing. Right. I don't mean COVID. I mean the political divisiveness.
Yeah. It's as if the social tools we have all developed these awful side effects that we never anticipated.
Right. So do you know social media was supposed to bring us together. That was the whole point of, don't be evil and all that.
Yeah. Well, those markers of identity are all too easy to deploy on social media, aren't they? Do you know the work of Peter Turchin?
Yeah, I haven't looked at that in a long time. I forget what he does.
Well, he makes mathematical models of human social dynamics, and one of his contributions has been to show, at least to my satisfaction, that there's an internal dynamic in human societies that causes these cyclical boom and bust, political boom and bust systems. He has a fairly recent book, 3 or 4 years old, on the political history of the United States that applies these models to exactly the problem that we have right now with the the divisiveness in our society. And he argues that the United States has gone through about 1.5 or 2 cycles. So we during the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War, well, that was a period of discontent in the United States, and the modern period is a second peak of discontent in his argument.
My problem with Peter Turchin's stuff is that it doesn't talk enough about what we're going through now, which is this demographic transition that started in Western cultures about 150 years ago and is now affected almost every human culture, where we're no longer competing for reproductive success. We're no longer families competing for reproductive success, and suddenly we're facing the likelihood that the human population is going to start to decrease simply because people don't want to go to the trouble of raising children because it's hard.
Well, I don't know. I mean, we know that if women are given economic empowerment and autonomy and education, they have fewer children, and for good reason. Well, part what you just said, but it's expensive and time consuming. And if you can also pursue a career with 1 kid rather than 2, then per couple, that's going to not replace the population in duration. To me, I think that's a good thing. Civil rights and women's rights and so on, and that's good. And then B, this is the overpopulation problem from the 60s and 70s. We don't have to worry about anymore. But right, just back up for a second on the.
I think it's an interesting problem.
Interesting problem. Yeah. Okay.
I think it's an interesting effect.
Yeah. But okay, so 2 things. One, on the I'm always skeptical of cyclical theories of history. We mentioned in our off-camera discussion, Stephen Jay Gould. He's a proponent of contingency, and I'm very much in that line. History moves along very contingent. There are very few cycles. Even economists now have largely given up on cyclical theories of economics. The joke is, the economists have predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions, right? I mean, it's just pretty unpredictable. And also, but implied in a cyclical theory of history is that there's some force, some not material, some kind of cultural thing that just happens without people somehow being involved as agents, active agents. And I just don't think that's how things work. But anyway, but back, Pete, just to drill down into which way the causal arrow is pointing. You could argue, well, we have these big brains, they evolved because we're a social species. But on the other hand, you could say we're a social species because we got these big brains for some other reason, and that enabled us to be social. Now, in your theory of the rapidly changing environment, of course, having big brains isn't going to affect the environment, but maybe we would have just gone extinct like most of the bipedal primates that lived, say, 150,000 years ago, along with us, 200,000, 300,000 years ago, Neanderthals, up to 35,000 years ago, and then maybe they had bigger brains for some other reason, and we did, and we survived, but the other ones just didn't, and so the causal arrow goes in the other direction.
Well, the big brains require big societies too. So the problem, we talk about this in the book, the problem with culture in chimpanzees, for example, is that little chimpanzees are very closely held by their mothers, and for example, in the case of termite fishing, the famous tool used by chimpanzees, little chimpanzees almost always learn this technique from their mothers, and only their mothers. And so the problem then is that if your mother doesn't know how to termite fish or is a poor termite fisher, you're stuck with her technique. On the other hand, if you have a large social network, then if mom's a poor termite fisher, but Auntie's a good one, then you can imitate Auntie rather than mom. And So you get a sort of a recombination effect. It's like genetic recombination. You can pick up one good technique from one person in your social network and a different good technique from somebody else in your social network, and this is one of the reasons that culture can change rapidly in response to climate change, for example. Or if you move to a new environment, you're forced to move to a new environment for some reason, and somebody figures out that a particular item is edible, and then that knowledge spreads to the whole group almost instantaneously in geological time, and so that's what makes cultural evolution more rapid than genetic evolution. It's one of the things it does, and so that's why it's a technique for adapting to variable environments.
And it may take quite a lot of brain power to say, oh my goodness, look, I have 4 different people, and the 4 different people are doing the same thing 4 different ways. What am I going to choose? What criteria am I going to use to decide whose technique to adopt? I mean, that may take quite a lot of brain power. I don't know. But that might help explain why we have such a big brain.
Then what do you make of Neanderthals going extinct, other than the 2 to 3% of their genes are in us? Because I call this the Stephen Stills effect. You know, if Stephen Stills, the singer, if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. So some of that obviously happened on those cold nights in those caves, but for the most part, I mean, they're species. If we define a species as a group of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations reproductively isolated from other such populations, memorized from Ernst Mayr when I took my evolution course long ago, then they had huge brains, bigger than ours, right? 1,600 cc's or so on average. Maybe they weren't as convoluted. I guess we don't know exactly that answer. But they had they had social groups, they had tools and so forth. What happened?
But they might not have had social tools. They might have just been unlucky that nobody came up with the social tools that allowed them to join up the way they would have had to deal with the last ice age, which was an absolute nightmare. Crazy climate change, and you needed to rely on other people. You needed a large population to figure out how to get through it, and it could just be that we're descended from the group of people that happened to invent the social tools.
Is language one of those?
Who knows? But we think, we say in the book that people had some kind of language going back hundreds of thousands of years.
Maybe 1.5 million years.
But obviously language doesn't fossilize very well, so we don't have any direct knowledge of language, except, Lieberman argued that the shape of the bottom of the skull suggested that Neanderthals didn't have speech. That's an extremely controversial idea, and so the evidence that we have is poor, I would say.
What's that? Wasn't there a bone in the throat that helps with language? Iax bone or something like that?
The hyoid bone, So it's the Adam's apple. It's a descended larynx, and Lieberman's story on that is, well, every hyoid bone, whether it's descended or not, looks about the same, and so it's not a diagnostic bone. That's part of the controversy that swirls around that. As far as I know, that controversy is just sort of lies on the ground. It's sort of historical. Nobody fights about that anymore because the fight's over and it was a draw. Is my take on it. Maybe there is somebody still trying to work on that problem. So I think the Neanderthal disappearance is really hard to account for. For example, it might be like Lesley says that modern humans, when they came out of Africa, came with social tools that were superior. They didn't seem to come with the stone tool record suggests that they made almost exactly the same kind of tools when they first arrived that the Neanderthals were making. So there doesn't seem to have been a big advantage that way. But both groups started making fancier tools. The Neanderthals were making fancier tools at the very end of their existence than they had before. And one explanation for that is diffusion from anatomical moderns from the Africans into the cultural diffusion into the Neanderthals. So this chattel-Peronian industry, I don't know if you run across that, but yeah, it was apparently made by Neanderthals, and yet it had some Upper Paleolithic kinds of overtones to it. So it could be that. Archaeologists seem to think that modern humans were about 10 times as numerous on the ground as Neanderthals. And that suggests what Lesley argued here a few minutes ago, that they had social tools that Neanderthals didn't have. They could maintain larger group sizes, and that could be an explanation. And another one, I mean, maybe we brought diseases out of Africa that whacked the Neanderthals, or maybe we just sort of mixed freely with them. But there were 10 times as many of us as there were of them, and so we just diluted away
the outbreeding theory. Yeah.
Yeah, so we just mixed with them, and since we were more numerous, we diluted their genes away. So we're Neanderthals. Now, it also is the case apparently that many Neanderthal genes were counter-selected in the hybrids, and so I think it's on the X chromosome. There are practically no Neanderthal genes at all on the X chromosome, and of course it's haploid in males, and so if there are essentially recessive lethals, or genes that act as recessive lethals on the X, then they'll be counter-selected more strongly than ordinary autosomes that for which everybody's diploid. So I don't know. I think it's all up in the air what happened to the poor Neanderthals if they were poor.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about yeah, go ahead.
They certainly had huge brains. There's no question about that.
Yeah. No, I just read the latest book on Neanderthals. The author's name is escaping me, and I had her on the podcast. British archaeologist. Anyway, it was stunning reading this book. I mean, essentially, it seems like their intelligence just as intelligent as we are. So obviously, it's something else like what you're talking about there. But I wanted to shift and talk about culture and the weirdest people on Earth. I had Joe Henrich on the podcast, read his book, which made me rethink everything I've ever read in anthropology and psychology, social psych, etc. Weird is Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. Most of social science is based on those people, which do not represent people currently living on Earth that are not weird. Not to mention everybody that came before. How do you think about the research that's done in the past and now in that context of, sampling, randomness, representative sampling of data sets like that?
So I think it's difficult to disentangle the weird effect from the modern effect. I mean, I think modern people are really, really different. And that's what we argue in the final chapter of our book.
Right.
Is that this complete change in the structure of social networks and learning that people you don't know, people who are completely different from you, are actually people too. We are a member of, we're American, we're English, we're Peruvian. this incredible ability to see ourselves as members of groups, including the human species, that's all really new. And I think that's very important. I think that when Joe wrote that book, he really wanted to say, well, there's something else going on. There's this weird thing that makes Europeans different. And he may be right, but it also just happens to be the case that people of European descent started this modernization thing about 3 generations sooner than everybody else. And that makes us, the people of European descent, a little bit different. But everybody else is catching up really, really quickly, aren't they?
Yeah, for sure. Again, showing that it's culture, not genes. I mean, Jared Diamond points out, Australian Aborigines can, in a generation, program computers, fly jets, and do anything we do. So clearly, that it's not an intelligence or hardwired issue there. How do you define culture? Just a small question.
Well, Rob and I define culture as that information that is transmitted by teaching or imitation. So
and shared in a population. It's a sort of information cloud that we can all tap into.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's very much like genes, except that the social learning is a completely different way of moving information from one person to another.
Yeah. What do you make of these stories of chimps that teach each other signs? And, you hear the elements of this, they imitate each other making tools or whatever. There's some of that, but it's clearly not remotely like the kind of culture we create. Do you consider like that pre-cultural abilities or something like this?
Well, we're living in what I think of as the golden age of animal social learning studies. So it turns out that all sorts of social animals learn from each other. And so there's this study of ants where knowledgeable ants will pick up another ant and drag it to the place where it should go, and so even ants have a little bit of social learning. And of course, there's a famous honeybee waggle dance that's a kind of social learning. So the social learning is very widespread. So but then how do we account for why humans make so much more use of it than other animals? So the corvid birds and the parrot family birds have big brains and are as cultural as chimpanzees, basically. So there's a whole several different lineages of animals have converged on this big brain adaptation, but they're all far short of human use of culture. We're the only species that makes massive use of culture, I would say, at least as far as we know. But it turns out to be an essential component of lots of adaptations. There's some nice work on animal migration. So it turns out that ungulates learn their migration routes from their fellow ungulates, mountain sheep, and that sort of thing. And if they're blocked from following their migration routes for a generation, then it's lost, and they gradually relearn it if they're then exposed to. For example, often animals migrate up and down mountainsides, going up to high elevation during the summer, and then going down to the bottom of the mountain during the wintertime when it's so cold and snowy up in the mountains. And mountain sheep that have been prevented from migrating will, over a few generations, will relearn their migration routes. And then there's those famous whooping cranes that lost their ability to migrate, and the conservation biologists trained them to, they caused them to what's the term? It caused them to think.
Imprint on the.
Yeah, imprint. That's the word I was missing.
Right.
So they imprinted them on ultralight airplanes, and then
I remember that.
they guided them down to the Caribbean coast on with ultralight airplanes. So they reestablished their migration patterns.
I could say.
So lots of animals do it, but humans have become specialists in it to the extent that our culture seems to have gained a life of its own. It's kind of out of our control, and it kind of controls us in a way that doesn't happen with animals.
Well, the fact that little children learn language so readily, so easily, with next to no instruction, and yet teaching them to read is a huge thing that takes years and practice and endless practice, as I well know. And so clearly one's more genetically based and one's more culturally based. And yet they're both kind of social tools. So you get a little bit of both genes and culture there.
Yeah. So, I think of the Holocene as a gigantic adaptive radiation of humans. So most human populations developed agriculture sometime in the Holocene, and but different crops with varieties that are suited to different environments, and so agricultural practices vary enormously, and over the last 10,000 years, we fit ourselves to the local environments in a highly specialized way, and that seems to me to be an analog of a genetic adaptive radiation that we know about from our evolution courses. And some hunting and gathering groups were still evolving up until contact with agriculturalists. So the Inuit people of the high Arctic, for example, within the last 1,000 years or so, a new group of the Inuit themselves spread from Alaska clear across to Greenland.
Yeah. Let me introduce you to my 5-year-old. Oops, that's Vincent. And I don't know where he went. Oh, he's hiding now. Okay. So sorry about that. This is what happens when you have a home studio, and I forgot to lock the door. Hey, Vincent, come on.
I was just thinking about what you said about reading and talking. I mean, it's just maybe that reading it's relatively recent, isn't it? I mean, it's maybe there's a better way. I mean, audiobooks are great, aren't they?
Yes, that's what I consume them every day. Well, so, but now I forgot what I was going to say. It's too funny. Hang on, let me close this door. Okay, it's all right. It's all right. It's all good. It's all good. Too much fun. That's the joys of a podcast. We can edit stuff out. We can do it. We can leave it in. Whatever. Who cares? All right. No, I was going to ask you. So agriculture. So, why? Why agriculture? I mean, if you look at skeletons before and after, clearly the hunter-gatherers before the first farmers were physically more capable, bigger, stronger bones, fewer diseases, fewer cavities. So clearly there's not some advantage to having farmed food, and yet we did it anyway. So what's your explanation for agriculture?
This is mine. So I think there is an advantage. And I think that it all has to do with the producing of offspring. So I think that however boring agricultural food is, however semi-unnutritious it is, or not a complete diet, it allowed the kind of stability that made it possible for mothers to raise their kids, because there was always something to feed them. And then, of course, it also, agriculture provides them with lots of kids with lots of work. So there's a good reason to have lots of them. And I mean, I think as soon as you start looking at what the women were doing and what their priorities were doing, a a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense starts to make more sense. So guys may have a lot more fun chasing around after animals, but, maybe they had a really bad run of luck for a couple of weeks. And then and so suddenly everybody's really glad that the women have been growing grain.
My answer is a little different. So it seems to me that the agriculturalists have an advantage because they're more numerous. So by dropping down on the food chain to eat plants means that you can support many more people per unit land area, and many more people translates basically into you can afford to pay more for the land, and so it's more, the land is more valuable to agriculturalists on a per acre basis than it is to hunter gatherers. And so one thing that farmers will do is organize to push hunter gatherers off if they object, but basically just push them off the land. Also, farmers tend to continue to hunt, and so they will deplete game that the hunter-gatherers need to feed themselves. So drop the game densities down by subsidizing their diets with plant products. You see this in hunter-gatherers themselves. So the Shoshone, Paiute groups that occupied large areas of the far west started down in the Owens Valley, and they became specialists on plants, and then they spread across the Great Basin in a wave about 700 years ago, and displaced the hunter-gatherers from the Great Basin, because my friend, the archaeologist Bob Bettinger, argues that basically they could outcompete the hunting specialists because the men still hunted, but the women gathered pine nuts and many other plant resources. So their diets were substantially plant-based, and they could just push the hunting specialists out. So, and that general kind of adaptation was common all over California. So the California people became specialists on acorns and annual plant seeds and that sort of thing, and they became intensive users of marine resources. Chumash down where you are a good example, and so the California people were except for the Colorado River Valley, were not agriculturalists, but they were plant specialists, and so their populations grew, and hunting became a kind of a secondary subsistence strategy.
And do you think there was some combination of climatic change and population growth around 10,000 years ago or so that then brought together those forces you're talking about? Because humans were hunter-gatherers for, a million years before that. Why not agriculture before that? So there had to be some other mitigating variables at work there.
Well, Bettinger and Rob and I wrote a paper about 20 years ago now, arguing that the Holocene is much less variable climatically than the last ice age. CO2 levels are higher, and climates got wetter. The last ice age climates tended to be pretty dry, and so the combination of the environmental change, several environmental features, made agriculture possible in the Holocene and impossible in the Pleistocene. you talk to farmers. Climate variation is a big problem even today, and it's sort of hard to imagine how those farming could have been possible in those wild climates of the last ice age. So that's our argument that it's the climate change that set up the world to make agriculture essentially mandatory in the long run. Now, there's some interesting estimates of the rate of population increase in the Holocene, comparing the rates of increase in the Near East, where the agriculture began, with rates of population increase in Colorado, where agriculture never took off, and not amongst the Aboriginal people at any rate. And so for a long time, the rates of population increase in Colorado were as fast as the rates of increase amongst agriculturalists in the Near East, if these estimates are correct. Very slow population growth rates. So the advent of the agriculture didn't really set off a population explosion. The population, if you look at the estimates of the world population growth over the last 10,000 years, it looks extremely slow for a long time, and then very late in time we get this huge spike in population in the last few hundred years, and so the idea that there were the advent of agriculture right away set off a population explosion doesn't seem to be true, and so it looks to me like it's a innovation limitation. In other words, the people in Colorado, the Native Americans in Colorado, they were increasing their population probably by adapting gradually to more plant-rich diets, even though they didn't get into agriculture. Plants are hard to figure out, right? They've got nutritional difficulties. Some of them are laced with toxins that you have to learn how to deal with, and so the growth of the use of plants was slow, both amongst agriculturalists and amongst hunter-gatherers. And then about I forget 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, the growth rate of population in Colorado stopped. Basically, they hit some kind of carrying capacity ceiling. They couldn't invent any better ways to utilize plants, whereas the agriculturalists continue to grow very slowly, but it's accelerating all the time. So it looks as if you can fit it with hyper-exponential models. That you imagine there are multiple positive feedbacks. The more people you have, the more inventors you've got, and so the population size itself feeds back positively on the rate of technology change. And the more technology you have, the more technology you can invent, because you get things that you can recombine. So you start with string, for example, and string can become thread that you can weave into cloth. Weaving techniques can be used to make baskets and mats and sails and
fishing
nets and hunting nets. And so there's a kind of a exponential compounding, and you get multiple exponential processes combining to make the rate of technological change faster, and those kind of models can be fit to the Holocene population curve fairly successfully. So,
I don't know if you read Matt Ridley's new book, How Innovation Works, but he shows that there are no examples of innovation that did not accumulate from other previous innovations just before and concurrently with other people. There are no lone geniuses just coming up with the light bulb or the internal combustion engine or some rocket or jet plane or whatever. This is how we know, by the way, parenthetically, that those UFOs that the Navy's been talking about, that they don't want to say they're aliens because they know what that sounds like. So they go, well, it might be Russian or Chinese assets. It's like impossible. There's no way the Chinese and Russians could invent some jet that could do stuff that we won't be able to do for centuries and defies all physics and aerodynamics without us knowing about it, right? Because that's not how innovation works. So whatever was going on 10,000 years ago, it would have been shared and dispersed and so on. By the way, I wanted to ask you if you, this is totally random. This isn't in your book at all, but Göbekli Tepe, have you followed this subject, this site in Turkey in which they have these monumental architecture, these T-shaped stones that are like 50 tons?
Yep.
And the problem to explain is, how is that possible? Because to build that kind of monumental architecture, you need farming and agriculture, so you have a huge population, so you can move these gigantic stones with thousands of people and so on. But they were hunter-gatherers, and they didn't even live there. They just showed up to drink beer or whatever. It was a spiritual center or something. And how is it they were able to do this? So, of course, the ancient aliens or the people that say there was some lost advanced Atlantean-type civilization 30,000 years ago. But maybe we've just underestimated the power of hunter-gatherers to do stuff, sort of the bigotry of low expectations.
But the thing I would say is that was almost certainly some kind of weird evolutionary runaway process. That it's actually stupid to build monumental architecture because it inhibits your reproductive success. And it's exactly the same kind of evolutionary processes that create ludicrous things like the tail of the peacock. Produces giant pyramids and the other monumental architecture, Stonehenge and all that nonsense. I mean, it kind of gets in the way of the point, but actually maybe that was part of the point. Those were social tools that distracted people from reproducing. And if people don't reproduce, then you don't have so many wars. And, so now we have a runaway process where everybody goes and gets a master's degree and a PhD and another PhD, and it doesn't seem like there's any way out of it.
Yeah.
But
I think the argument is that it brings people together and like what's the role of religion? Well, it unites people, kind of a group selection argument. It helps with cooperation, something like that.
Yeah.
It's a social tool.
Yeah, it's a social tool. Yeah.
So we do talk in one chapter of the book about that sun gear burial in Russia. That the spectacular couple of burials actually that apparently the guy who was buried was covered with ivory beads and
thousands of them.
Thousands of them, yeah, and the time it took to make those was pretty incredible. So somehow people had costumed that guy, and Lesley invents a story about what happened and why people did that. And it was for her story, it was a big gathering that people had, and he was a sort of a high priest. And turns out he was stabbed and killed. So maybe it was some kind of human sacrifice rather than he wasn't so much an autocrat or a big man. He was a priest who sacrificed himself or allowed himself to be sacrificed for some ceremonial purpose. Now that's a story and we make a big point in the book of the fact that it's very difficult to tell a detailed story about the past that is both certainly true and it covers all the facts of life. In other words, we can reconstruct a story about that's consistent with the evidence, but many stories are probably consistent with the scanty evidence that we have. So lots of people interpret that sun gear burial as an example a big man type society where there's
Right.
substantial status differences and power differences between individuals.
Yeah.
Quite different from our typical picture of hunter-gatherers being egalitarian. So,
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. To what extent are hunter-gatherers egalitarian, or is it kind of enforced through norms and rules that you better share the food or else? So maybe they aren't by nature egalitarian. It's just the nature of their social structure. It has to be that way. And then you get this hierarchy with agriculture. Once populations get big, and then then you have the problems with that, which also seem counterproductive. Theft of people's wealth and massive inequalities, and then abuse of citizens by kings and dictators and rulers and priests controlling large populations and so forth. What's your sense about how that developed?
Another way of looking at that is that there's bound to be hierarchy in any family because some people are older than other people. So the 8-year-old has higher status than the 4-year-old. The 12-year-old has higher status. So if you like, there is a kind of instinctive hierarchy because we all, as we age and become cleverer and more knowledgeable, we rise through that kind of hierarchy. But when you describe the city or the agricultural area, what you're then looking at is not hierarchy between individuals, but hierarchy between families. So there might be a very powerful, successful ruling family, and so they have a hierarchy, and within their own family, there's also a hierarchy, based on age. But the hierarchy is really between these different social units that we call hierarchies. And I mean, I think if you start thinking about people as being really groupy, it starts giving you a different way of looking at hierarchy.
Yeah, excuse me. My take on it is much like Chris Bohm's. I think he's got a good argument for how egalitarianism is enforced or relative egalitarianism is enforced in hunting and gathering societies. Richard Wrangham has a similar idea about weapons being used to knock down big shots who get too big for their britches. And so I think that's a good argument. Monique Burgerhoff-Mulder and Sam Bowles and colleagues did a lot of work on what leads to hereditary inequality. And so you might imagine that all sorts of things are transmitted from parents to kids. For example, political skills. Polly Wiesner talks about the big men of New Guinea, the Enga of New Guinea, being usually the offspring of other big men. So boys learn the techniques of political techniques from their fathers and uncles and so on. But what Bowles and Monique, Sam and Monique discovered was that you have to have inheritance of property to get hereditary inequality. Just knowledge alone won't do it. You have to be able to endow your kids with land or cattle or some other resource like that to create hereditary inequality. Yeah. And it, I mean, it's the empiricism is a bit scrappy, but it makes sense to me at least that's a reasonable argument. So we get hereditary inequality in farming populations, but not so much in hunter-gatherers. Now, of course, the sun gear burial, who knows? What lots of people interpret that as at least some kind of inequality. And there are many societies that have competitive status competitions that lead to inequality, but not hereditary inequality. So lots of societies, there's big distinctions amongst adults in their status, but it's only weakly transmitted to their offspring. So that could, the sun gear burial could be a signal of that sort of competitive, but not hereditary inequality.
Yeah. And then let's talk about pair bonding and polygamy, monogamy, marriage. How do you think about those institutions? As you know, modern conservatives say, well, the nuclear family, that's the normal natural family. And then when Hillary says it takes a village, then the conservatives' heads explode. Oh, that's just socialism or whatever. Okay, these are extreme versions, right? But how do you think about how those institutions or evolved tendencies came about?
Well, I'm going back right to the very early stage. We have these really powerful emotions which make us bond with one another and love one another. The hormones, the neurotransmission involved is similar, whether you love your dog or whether you love your spouse or whether you love your baby. I mean, we know that goes on. I think that what culture does with its social tools is that it enhances it and directs it. And so if you have a whole group of people who are invested in the idea that, there's a husband and a wife, and then the husband brings all his family together with the wife bringing all her family, and a whole bunch of rules about behavior, then you create a really stable environment for raising a child. And I think that we are descended from groups that had those stable environments. We inherited the genes of those people, and we inherited the culture of those people. The nuclear family is this weird kind of aberration which started because of industrialization, when it became necessary for people to travel. I mean, it turns out it is kind of a European thing because the Northwestern Europeans had this notion of an independent household. But kin and family, the historians show, was really important until relatively recently, until everybody had to leave their family and go and chase work so they could get money. The nuclear family is not traditional. It is really recent and really aberrant. So that's my feeling.
Yeah. Almost all societies have some form of marriage, not exactly all. There are these families, these social groups scattered around the world for which males are economically unimportant. Fairly frequently, they're tropical forest horticulturalists, in which women's labor is much more important than men's labor.
Women and children's labor.
Women and children's labor is much more important than men's labor, and marriage bonds are extremely weak. Men compete with each other to have girlfriends, basically, and the maternal family takes care of all of the child rearing duties, and men do hardly any work at all. So I was I have a friend who is an expat in Zambia, and for many years he still lives there, and he started a little charity and made myself and one of my friends directors of his charity, and so we went one time to Zambia to have a directors meeting, and it was kind of a joke. But he did take us to see this very interesting Zambian woman who was organizing to try to bring aid to the poorest communities in Zambia. She was focused on these poor rural communities. And she had these facts and figures. She was an impressive lady. So women in Zambia work about 2,000 hours a year, which is basically full-time work. Men work about 500 hours a year. And so her whole program was based on putting men to work. And she said, if Zambia villages are going to modernize, it's not going to be because women do more work, because they're already doing all the work they can do. But men are drastically underemployed. So her whole strategy was to basically shame men into working harder, develop projects that would basically bring men closer to full employment.
But you don't shame men into doing anything. You give them power. I mean, you have to buy it. I mean, men are more likely to work on a project if you say you're the boss. Even if they don't really actually make many of the important decisions.
So, you mean because males have more interest in status seeking?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, they need to have some kind of incentive to work. I mean, everybody needs some kind of incentive to work. Women are very internally driven to care for their children once they have them, so they're kind of forced to work. If men can be encouraged to help, then that's really good. That one social tool is to give men status and to encourage them to compete for it.
Yeah, right. Well, that's related to moral emotions, morality. So let's kind of bring this around toward the end of talking about the evolution of morality and then violence and war. I'm curious to know what you guys think about, this debate about to what extent our Paleolithic ancestors were warlike. Well, if you define war as, two massive armies lined up, well, they can't have war because they just didn't have massive armies because they didn't have masses. But conflict between groups, say, and, whatever tools you have to fight with, maybe they're not as deadly as poison gas and airplanes and bombs, but, that in our genes, there is this tendency not to fight, like in a hydraulic theory of violence that Freud had. You just got to let it out because it's building up like steam. That's a bunch of bunk. But that there is kind of a logic to deterrence, to having the status as, I'm going to protect my group, my family, my community. And so because those guys over there may come over to take our stuff. So if I have a reputation that I will fight if necessary, you're less likely to attack me. So there's a logic to deterrence there, something along those lines. How do you think about war and conflict that way?
Well, I was impressed by some models that Sergei Gavrilets, University of Tennessee, made, in which he looked at the evolution of basically interference competition. War is a form of, you might think of interference competition, versus what ecologists call scramble competition. You don't actually interfere with the resource getting efforts of your neighbor, but you try hard to be wealthier than they are, to be more efficient at exploiting your environment. And so he compared what he called games of us against them versus games of us against nature. And it turns out that cooperation can evolve for both reasons, but it's somewhat easier to evolve, in his models at least, to evolve cooperation for us against them. So warfare, interference competition more generally, is something that evolves rather easily in his models, and it's a little bit more difficult to organize cooperation for us against nature games. And so this is the logic of arms races. You can't be sure that your neighbors are going to be nice to you, so you arm, and once you're armed, then and they have to fear you, and so everything spirals out of control.
But, and it's important, is war is really wasteful.
That's a point of so in Sergei's models, average fitness goes down as interference competition rises, and of course in games against nature, fitness increases as you cooperate more. So mean fitness will increase in games against nature and decrease in games of us against them. So warfare is it's one of those things. We think of natural selection and other cultural evolutionary forces as favoring adaptation, but in lots of cases, selection and related kinds of processes in culture favor maladaptations. In other words, situations in which the mean fitness goes down rather than up, and interference competition is an example.
Although there may be trade-offs with other values. So, for example, like why do we have psychopaths at all? If we're self-domesticated, why didn't we get rid of every last bully and Machiavellian narcissist and so on? Well, Christopher Boehm's point is that would take too much energy and too much time to get rid of every last one. A society can tolerate 1% to 3% of these people and still function pretty well. If it was 10%, 20%, maybe not 50%, the group would be doomed. But so maybe war is like that. You can have some that's inevitable because of the security dilemma or the Hobbesian trap, as it's called, as you just described it. I got to have it because he has it. I'm a nice guy. Maybe he's a nice guy, but I don't know for sure he's a nice guy, so I better arm just in case, and so on. You can do some of that, and if you have a conflict and maybe 10 to 20% of the population gets wiped out, like in some of these archaeological sites, that's what it looks like 10, 20% died violently. And but that still leaves 80% of the population to carry on to go forth and multiply, as the Bible says.
But the thing is that if you invent the social tools that reduce warfare, you are more efficient as a group.
Yeah.
So we're not descended from the people who fought themselves into the ground. We're descended from the people who managed to avoid that.
Yes, that's a good point. Yes, right. Right. Yes, although politically, we've only just in the last 50 years invented tools to prevent any more great power wars, through the United Nations and trades and treaties and pacts and so forth. But that's so new. It's not even clear that that's going to work for the next couple centuries, but we'll see.
But great powers are also new. I mean, there didn't used to be that many great powers.
Yeah.
They didn't last, right?
Yeah.
There's this concept in evolutionary biology of frequency-dependent selection. Did you get exposed to that in your?
Yeah. No. Go ahead. You give us the brief rundown on that.
Well, it's just what you described with regard to psychopathy. If psychopaths are rare enough, then they might have more children than the average person. But if they're so as long as we're all fairly trusting, because only 3% of the population are psychopaths, we don't run into psychopaths that often. So we don't, as you reported Boehm saying, well, it's just not worth our while to imagine that each person that we run across is a psychopath. That would make us too suspicious and cause us to waste a lot of time reassuring ourselves that our boss or our coworker or our wife is not a psychopath. We'd be too suspicious. But if the frequency of psychopaths goes up some, then we do have to get more suspicious, and we start being more careful about locking our doors and hiring some cops to suppress these people, and so there'll be an equilibrium point at which the psychopaths have the same fitness as the rest of us, and so psychopathy seems to be a little bit more frequent than you could explain by, say, mutation or recombination. It seems to me it's a likely candidate for frequency-dependent selection. And warfare could be the same.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the characteristics of psychopathy apparently is charm. They're charming. So that could increase their reproductive success. Maybe they don't mean it. They're faking. They're employing theory of mind to figure out what it is they're supposed to pretend to be caring about. But to my point on the evolution of morality, if you don't actually believe it, if you're just pretending to be cooperative and altruistic and nice and pro-social, but you're a Machiavellian faker just to manipulate and capitalize on people's goodwill, your fellow group members are going to catch on to that. You're going to give off tells and so on. So you have to actually believe it. You actually have to feel like I care about these other people I'm in my group with, my family, my group mates, and so on. And that's about as genuine a morality as you can get. I developed this argument because I'm debating theists who employ the divine command theory. Well, God tells us, or God makes things right or wrong. Well, but I'm an atheist, so what? Okay. And then it's interesting that evolutionary psychologists and evolutionary theories really didn't deal with the evolution of morality until Darwin sort of started it, and then it didn't pick up again until like the 80s and 90s. Interesting gap there, but I do think we have a pretty good handle on how that develops now, and that's about as good as it gets. It's in our nature to want to be pro-social, cooperative, and so on under the right conditions, and I guess you would say with the right social tools that bring out our better angels and suppress our inner demons.
Yeah.
And the fact that we no longer live in families that are competing for reproductive success is a big bonus, because in the future, right now we're all worried about immigrants, but as the number of young people who can do work diminishes as a proportion of the population, we're going to be scrambling for as many young immigrants as we can get our hands on, right?
Yeah. Especially as baby boomers that are going to be dependent on Social Security continuing. We need them to be working and paying into Social Security. All right, let's wrap this up and get to your last chapter. You wrote this book as you're in the middle of writing this book. We hit a pandemic, and so you would think that an external threat to all of humanity would bring us all together, and yet I'm not that encouraged by how it's unfolded.
Well, it didn't divide us entirely. Like most things, it's just as good as it can be, but not as good as it could be. I don't know. We're getting through it, aren't we? There's ultimately there'll be this vaccine, and
well, I think we're close to that.
To take it or not.
Yeah. But so just kind of project forward the social tools we have. What other social tools do we need to expand the moral sphere to include all people, and maybe animal rights, or whatever the current issues are or will be in the coming decades and centuries? How do you see our species developing socially along those lines?
It's really hard, really hard to predict. But I think we have a big problem with freedom. I'm really interested to know what you think about this, because I don't know if you still call yourself a libertarian, but we can't be free and as intensely social as we are. There has to be some middle ground. We have to find the rules and the tools to make and enforce responsibility for others, responsibility for the bigger picture of what, and some kind of way of agreeing on what we want. The inventions may come. Let's hope they do, but it's hard to predict what they might be.
Yeah. Well, one is that rights revolutions copy each other. So yesterday I was talking with Jonathan Rausch. He has a new book out, The Constitution of Knowledge. So he's a big defender of kind of civil liberties and classical liberalism, and he's gay. So he's been just stunned at how fast the gay rights revolution unfolded in just like 20 years compared to maybe 50 years for women and centuries for African Americans and people of color and so on. And the reason is that they copy each other. So the same arguments that are used in one can be used in the other rights revolution. And John Stuart Mill made this point in 1859, his On Liberty. This is why exchanging ideas openly and freely allows people to kind of exchange those social tools and arguments. Why should I treat a woman this way or a gay person that way or whatever? Well, here's the reasons that Martin Luther King articulated 50 years ago. Oh, okay, and then you can make that argument. So I think maybe we'll see more of that. Libertarian. Okay, I don't really call myself that anymore because there's a lot of kind of goofy fringe people in that movement, and also I agree that what is meant by freedom has been badly misunderstood. It's like I shouldn't have to wear a mask, but the same people that say that would completely agree with a restaurant owner who says no shoes, no shirt, no service. And the conservative will go, yes, of course, it's his business. Okay, how about no mask? No service. Oh, that's different somehow. Or guns. I think we should have gun control, right? That's not really a libertarian position. But it's clear that you should be free to have a gun, but I should be free from being shot by your gun, and so on. These are collective action problems, and I agree. I don't think some things like the interstate highway system, say, or vaccines or something like that, can be solved by one corporation or one individual. Bill Gates is not going to build Interstate 10 from Santa Monica to Florida or wherever it goes. It's just not going to happen, right? So some collective action problems can only be solved that way. So the question is, does it depend on my really caring about complete strangers, or is there some selfish motive, or maybe not selfish, but like what's in it for me? Well, in the long run, I'm going to benefit because we're all going to benefit, something like that.
Yeah, so it seems to me that there has been a lot of progress. I read a book 10, 20 years ago that was a sort of a diplomatic history of the 20th century, including back in the 1890s. So sometime in the 1890s, there was a big international conference on warfare and trying to instantiate some rules of warfare. And in that period, the idea that of national sovereignty was extremely strong. So nations made their own laws, and nobody could argue with that. And then gradually, the diplomacy and international law evolved to create the concept of war crimes, for example. So the Germans after the Second World War argued that some Germans who'd misbehaved, let's say, argued, well, German law made it imperative that I kill Jews, for example. And the Nuremberg Trials, actually, the author, pointed to a kind of a trivial case that set the precedent for Nuremberg. And what it had to do with people at one of these institutions for the insane that had the tools to do euthanasia, and the German authorities brought them some. I think they were Russian prisoners that they wanted to get rid of, and so they euthanized them under orders from the Gestapo or whoever, and they were eventually convicted of crimes against humanity for killing these Russian prisoners. And so that overturned this concept of untrammeled national sovereignty. And so her argument was that over the long 20th century, lots of progress was made on these issues. You mentioned that we haven't had any great power conflicts since World War II, at least not hot ones. And so that is some kind of progress over the last half century or so. And so it gives you reason for hope. Now, take something like climate change. We've got the Paris Accords, but they're not quite good enough, and we're not quite living up to them. So we made a lot of progress on climate change, but not enough progress yet, at any rate. So the sustainability of modernity is in question, it seems to me, for both environmental reasons and, as we've talked about, demographic ones too. That modern people aren't replacing themselves, and on the other hand, there are these little pockets of people like North American Anabaptists and ultra-Orthodox Jews who are. I made a back-of-the-envelope calculation one time, and I convinced myself that North American population will be half Anabaptist in about 200 years. So
yes, well, I made a back-of-the-envelope calculation based on the rise of the nuns, the people that tick the box for no religious affiliation. It's like tripled in the last 20 years, right? So I just carried it out to, like 2070, there'll be no more religious people. Ha, ha, ha. Like that's going to happen. Yes.
Well, I don't know. The Europeans are down that road further than we are.
No, it's incredible what's happening.
So I'd like to know what you guys think about a way of identifying people. I mean, everybody thinks how horrific to have every single person in the world with a chip in them that identifies them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a technological solution to a problem that we all know about. We don't know half the people around us. Could that be a social tool that helps? Or is it just too horrific?
I mean, there's some research showing that exposure to gays, for example, makes you less homophobic. That is, if you know somebody at work and they're gay and you think, oh, well, that doesn't apply to him, these prejudices, or black or Jew or whatever. So I do think, just pop culture, travel, things like that, books, reading, internet, and so on, helps push it a little bit. Those ingrained xenophobic tendencies we have are pretty strong. As we've seen, it's easy for a I wrote my book, The Moral Arcody, in 2015. So Trump comes into power in 2016, and the populists go crazy with the immigration and economic nationalism. And I was amazed at how quickly so many people, not just Americans, but others in Great Britain and Turkey and a few of the other autocratic countries now, turned to populism. It was just so easy to happen, just to snap into place. Like, those immigrants, they're taking your jobs, or they're bringing disease or whatever, the China virus, right? Okay. So yeah, I mean, obviously it's in our nature, and it's easy to go back to that pretty quickly, which makes me worried. I mean, the social tools are there, but we have to be vigilant constantly.
Yeah, well, I think we scientists are part of international enterprises, right? So we go to scientific meetings where people from all over the world turn up. Now, they don't turn up. Africans don't turn up in large numbers at scientific meetings, unfortunately, but all the Europeans do, and the Japanese and increasingly the Chinese are participants. So, you do, as you say, you rub shoulders with these people, and they're fine.
Yeah.
They're contributing to the scientific enterprise. They aren't trying to stab you or hit you with a stick. And so, one of my nephews was gay, and he was my half sister was almost 20 years older than I was, so her kids were almost my age. So I knew this kid from the time I was 5 or 6 years old, and he was always weird.
He wasn't weird, Dominic. Stop it.
He was weird, but he wasn't harm. There was no harm in him. It's just that he didn't.
That's too funny.
I'd go visit him, and I'd want to play cops and robbers and cowboys and stuff, and he wanted to play dolls with my sister. Well,
yes.
He was the head of the women of the
I wouldn't
family.
use it. Yeah, I wouldn't use that word "weird" at this point. No, cognitively. No, what's the neurodiversity is the new term for like autism, things like that. Well, I do think the scientific model of how to engage with other people in the kind of open dialogue, open disputation, debate, where that's normal, and you don't attack the other person, you just attack their theories or their ideas or whatever, and this is how we get to the truth. Yeah. So the epigram to the moral arc is from J. Robert Oppenheimer in 1949. There must be no barriers to freedom of inquiry. There is no place for dogma in science. The scientist is free and must be free to ask any question, to doubt any assertion, to seek for any evidence, to correct any errors. Our political life is also predicated on openness. We know that the only way to avoid error is to detect it, and that the only way to detect it is to be free to inquire. And we know that as long as men are free to ask what they must, free to say what they think, free to think what they will, freedom can never be lost and science can never regress. So I think that's the kind of norm that we have to keep pushing constantly against both factions on the far right and the far left that are becoming more censorious in the last few years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was on a plane a couple of weeks ago, and the person sitting next to me, I suppose I should have expected it, announced that she wasn't going to get the vaccine because she thought that COVID was a hoax and it was all designed to destroy the economy.
Yeah. Right.
And
right.
I mean, and the weird thing is, even though I know I have to be really open-minded, it was very difficult. It was very difficult.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's part of the kind of politicization of everything. I mean, there's people that are vaccinated, liberals who are vaccinated, who wear a mask anyway so that people don't think they're Republicans. I mean, come on. Really? This is what we've come to? I mean, come on. Jesus.
Yeah, well, in a college town like Davis, this is all too common now. By now, most people in Davis have been vaccinated because we've had a very aggressive, the university had a very aggressive vaccination program. Yeah. And anybody can get a vaccine if they want one.
In Davis, people, when at the height of the pandemic, if people were driving by and they saw two people too close together, they'd shout at them and tell them to stay 6 feet apart.
Really?
Pretty draconian.
Oh boy, that's crazy. All right, I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to read the last paragraph of your book. I loved your book. Our ancestors tackled their challenges as part of a collective or a team. Our interconnected world and the problems we share encourage us to see all humans as part of the same team. Perhaps our biggest challenge is developing social tools that will make this a reality, with everyone on the human team sharing the opportunities, responsibilities, and rewards of an adventurous life. Hallelujah. Amen, brother. I like that. So, thanks for coming on the show. What's next on your research and writing agendas?
Well, I'm anxious to write a paper on human macroevolution.
How macro?
Excuse me?
How macro?
Well, the explaining the big events, we've talked about it here. Some of the evolution of our big brains, the origins of agriculture, these kinds of things. Yeah. And this is a fraught subject in evolutionary biology. One of my teachers of evolution was a guy Jim Valentine, a National Academy member who was is a paleontologist, and so Jim was interested in these long time scale, big event kinds of features of evolution, and so he was, for example, interested in the diversity of shelly marine creatures, because that's what the fossil record is at best for clams and snails and so on. And so he had this theory of how plate tectonics turns out that the shelly marine invertebrates are more diverse today than they've ever been in the history of the Earth. And so he was interested in why that is.
All right.
And his argument was the world was broken up into a bunch of small continents, many of them oriented north and south, and the poles were cold and the tropics were hot. So the world was just had more niches for snails and clams than it ever had before. So, but I always thought that Stephen Jay Gould messed up the whole science of macroevolution.
Don't get an argument. Don't get an
Oh, no,
So what
okay.
I want to do, what I want to
Lesley.
do is I want to take our new view of evolution and show how it makes our world and the humans look differently.
Good.
Because I want to gradually change the public's belief about what evolution tells us about ourselves.
Yeah. Good. We need that now. All right, guys. Thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for writing your book and for your important work. We'll see you next time.